Okay, there is a glaring historical mystery hiding right in plain sight at the very foundation of Christianity. And today we're diving right into it. We're unpacking some groundbreaking insights drawn directly from the research of Professor James D. Tabor, a historian of early Christianity. He points out this massive, often completely overlooked divide in the historical record, a fracture between the original earthly followers of Jesus and the Apostle Paul.
Have you ever stopped to really think about the Apostles' Creed? What's profoundly interesting here isn't just what it says, but what it leaves out. Its silence is deafening. According to the source material, this foundational confession of early Christians jumps straight from conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, immediately over to crucified, died, and was buried. It literally skips over his entire life, his parables, his actions, his actual ethical teachings, completely gone. Professor Tabor actually spent 30 years investigating this exact silence.
And this missing chunk brilliantly illustrates how the foundation of what most people today consider Christianity was built almost entirely on his birth and his death. The religion is essentially framed by Christmas and Easter. But what about the actual day-to-day lifetime of prophetic actions, the missing years? Well, Professor Tabor argues that this creedal framework, this intense focus on the cross and the resurrection as the only mechanisms of salvation, was driven largely by the Apostle Paul and not the original earthly followers.
Let's dive into Section 1, the lost message of Q.
Long before the formal creeds were ever written down, there were much earlier traditions. One of the most fascinating is what scholars call the Q document. It's essentially a collection of about 250 shared sayings of Jesus that pop up in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke but are completely missing from Mark. This material gives us a profound, unfiltered look into those earliest followers. And the most striking part, it doesn't mention the virgin birth. It doesn't mention the blood on the cross at all.
For Jesus' own brother, James, and the followers of this Q source, their movement was profoundly earthly. Following this path literally meant things like paying fair wages to your workers, establishing a kind of ancient minimum wage. It prioritized internal ethics way over external rituals. It was deeply, deeply rooted in the tradition of ancient Hebrew prophets like Amos and Micah, who demanded justice and kindness. Notice there is absolutely no mention of creedal theology here. It's entirely about how you actually treat your fellow human beings.
I absolutely love this ancient saying because it captures the practical essence of this earthy, ethical movement perfectly. Let your money sweat in your hands until you know to whom you give it. Think about that. It's asking people to think deeply about their actions, to be fiercely intentional about their charity, rather than just making some big public display of their religion. It's highly practical, it's situational, and it is incredibly grounded.
Moving right along to Section 2, Paul's visionary gospel. Now we hit a stark historical contrast. On one hand, you have James and Peter. They spent countless hours with the physical Jesus. They ate with him, they walked with him, they knew him in the flesh. But Paul never met the physical Jesus, not once. His sole claim to authority came from what the ancient world called apparitions, and what we might call clairvoyant visions of a heavenly cosmic Christ. He claimed to hear a voice and essentially received direct spiritual downloads.
And because Paul's connection was entirely spiritual and visionary, the earthly life of Jesus, those parables, the teachings about the minimum wage, the sweaty money, all of that took a back seat. For Paul, there was really only one theological focal point. As he put it, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. The cross and the resurrection became the absolute entirety of his message.
Which brings us to a massive paradigm shift in Section 3, reading the Bible backwards.
Most of us, naturally, read the New Testament front to back, right? Starting with Matthew. But historically speaking, that is completely out of order. The crucifixion happens at year 0, but the very first document written in the New Testament isn't a gospel at all. It's actually Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, written some 20 years later. The Gospels themselves aren't codified until 40 or more years after the fact. What does this mean? It means Paul laid down the doctrinal concrete decades before the Gospels were even finalized. Those later writers were already heavily influenced by Paul's creedal framework.
Let's look at why he did this in Section 4, 5 minutes to midnight.
11:55 p.m. According to Professor Tabor, you simply cannot understand the Apostle Paul unless you realize he firmly believed he was living at 5 minutes to midnight. He writes that the form of this cosmos is passing away. He genuinely believed that the physical creation was actively shifting, and that the end of the age, the literal resurrection of the dead, and the transformation of the world was going to happen in his own generation.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why Paul taught what he taught.
Because the clock was ticking so incredibly fast, Paul instituted what we'd call situational ethics. If you were a slave, Paul said just remain a slave. Social status means absolutely nothing because the world is ending. Marriage, he advised against it, believing genders would soon cease to exist in the new spiritual reality. What about eating meat sacrificed to pagan idols in the Corinthian market? He said if your conscience is clear, eat it, because those idols literally don't exist and the current world is evaporating anyway. Why worry about earthly institutions if midnight is about to strike?
And finally, Section 5, the Battle of the Apostles. As you might expect, this radically apocalyptic, visionary approach eventually collided hard with the original Jerusalem followers. Historical research championed by early scholars like F.C. Bauer and echoed by Professor Tabor suggests a deep fracture occurred. Toward the end of his life, Paul makes a definitive sharp break with James, Peter, and the Jerusalem establishment. He actually refers to them in his letters as the so-called pillars of the church, boldly stating that their earthly authority means nothing to me. He completely isolates himself to go his own independent way, guided strictly by his visions.
In the language in his letters gets incredibly intense. Paul writes to the Galatians, "If we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel, let them be anathema," which effectively translates to let them go to hell. It really shows just how deeply Paul believed that his direct visionary truth completely outweighed the physical, earthly traditions that James and Peter were trying to maintain.
Which leaves us here. If we define modern Christianity by the creeds, by the focus on the virgin birth, the cross, and the doctrines we know today, rather than the day-to-day earthly ethics of the Q document in James, and if we acknowledge that Paul wrote his letters decades before the Gospels were even formed, we are left with this fascinating, truly provocative question to ponder. Is the Apostle Paul the true founder of the Christian religion? It's an incredible historical puzzle, and understanding it completely changes the way you look at the entire New Testament. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you on the next one.